Good afternoon, gentlemen and ladies. I'd like to start the final session for today. Thank you. Good afternoon and welcome to the panel that's entitled Who Speaks for the People? Justice, Democracy, and Political Legitimacy. My name is Michael Popich. I'm a professor of philosophy at Westminster College down the road from here, and I'm happy to be here participating in this conference on global justice. We have one full speaker this afternoon. The second speaker was unable to make it, so Professor Nicole Hassoun will deliver a extended version of her paper first, and then Professor Luke Garrott will respond to that and with commentary on the paper that's missing, and I will probably kibitz on that as well on the issue of transitional justice. So thank you all for coming. I'm going to, in the interest of getting started somewhat a little bit late, but still have enough time for questions and discussion like we did in the last session, turn it over to Professor Hassoun.
All right, so thanks again for having us and putting together such a good conference. I really, it's an honor to be here and have the opportunity to talk with everyone today. I'm going to talk about a strand in an argument in my book that's forthcoming with Cambridge. So I'm really excited about it. Since I have a few minutes, I'm going to tell you about how I got interested in this project and how the argument I'm going to give today fits into it. So I was doing some research with the Philippine Community Organizers Society several years ago, and they took me to visit this woman, Tamil, who was living in the garbage dump and picking up garbage to sell to the recyclers. She made about $2 a day, and it was striking to see how this woman was living in light of the fact that about 2.5 billion people, half the world's population, lives on the equivalent of what $2 a day buys in the US. And so as globalization sort of shrinks distance and it brings people around the world into closer contact, I think it raises these pressing issues of global justice. You know, what, if any, obligations do we have to people like Tamil? And so I give a new argument that is supposed to extend the consensus on the conclusion that there are significant obligations to the global poor. It's not grounded in a concern just for people's interests or autonomy, but from the idea that we are imposing certain kinds of coercive rules on people that require justification. So I'll tell you about that, but I just want to tell you about the second half of the book, because part of the assumption in this argument is that what I say later is correct. Okay. So the second half of the book goes on to consider some of the rules and institutions that are guiding development. And in particular, it considers the case for certain kinds of foreign aid and free trade. And I argue that there is good empirical evidence that certain kinds of aid work. Micro-level, experimental and quasi-experimental evidence, and large-scale macro-level evidence that certain kinds of aid in general do good. And there's also a case for giving or promoting certain kinds of free trade, although trade has mixed impacts on poor people. Sometimes it's beneficial and sometimes it's not. And so there's reasons to work around some of the rules of trade or amend them to capture the benefits of trade for the poor and avoid the costs. And there's ways of doing that through things like linking trade agreements to improve labor standards or wages in developing countries.
We do have a clicker right here.
Oh, fantastic.
And it's also, just be careful not to walk in front of the speaker.
Oh.
You can walk.
Okay. All right. Anyway, clicker, I'm not that's technologically savvy here, so I'm going to use my hands. The final chapter of the book concludes with a proposal that I'm really excited about for something like fair trade in pharmaceutical and biotechnology. And the thought is to rate pharmaceutical companies' efforts to extend access on essential drugs and medicines to the poor. And then give, say, the top 10% of companies a label they could use on all their products, everything from pet vitamins to mouthwash, maybe 2 aisles worth of stuff in your grocery store. And it'd be like a fair trade label so that if consumers were willing to purchase these products a little bit more, that would give companies an incentive to do whatever gets them highly rated. And if universities, for instance, made it a condition of the sale of their licenses that companies holding their technology should be highly certified, highly rated, that would, again, create more incentive for companies to do whatever gets them highly rated. And so I think this could be one way of addressing some of the problems that poor people face. I don't think there's a single problem of poverty. You can't address it in one single way. Poor people face many problems. So this might help them access essential medicines. In any case, I'm going to assume, for the sake of argument today, that many people lack basic capacities, basic reasoning and planning capacities, because they suffer from autonomy undermining illnesses. So diseases like malaria can undermine people's ability even to do things like reason and plan. And I'm going to also assume there are many things we can do about it. Okay? But I encourage you to read the book if you're skeptical. I'm going to defend two general propositions. And you have a handout. If you don't have a handout, you can raise your hand, and hopefully one will find its way to you. Okay, so you'll get a handout. But the first claim is that what I'll call the legitimate coercion autonomy thesis. And the idea is that coercion can only be legitimate if it's exercised over people who secure basic capacities, basic reasoning and planning capacities. And I'll explain that in a minute. But the second claim is that legitimacy entails that those who are exercising coercion are obligated to ensure that the coercion is legitimate. This legitimacy obligation entails that. Their thesis is just that. Okay. So let me talk about the first one first. But I want to note that if these two propositions are correct, they have really significant implications for global justice. That is, if there are many coercive international institutions, as I'll argue very briefly at the end, then these two theses are really general, right? They talk about coercive rulers in general, not just states. And so there'll be obligations of global legitimacy or justice that arise out of concern for coercion wherever it's exercised. Okay, so let's look at these two theses first. So the first claim is that people have to be able to secure basic capacities under coercive rule. And the basic capacities I'll use just to illustrate the form of the argument are really minimal. So I'm going to start with the assumption that people have to be able to do certain kinds of instrumental reasoning and planning. So means ends reasoning. I'm not assuming that they have to have full Kantian conceptions of morality or anything like that, that they just have to be able to make the kinds of plans they need to consent to or object to coercive rules. So they can't be torn apart by competing desires and unable to reason in that way. They can't be bound or constrained, so they're unable to actually carry out their plans to, say, object to or consent to a coercive rule. Okay. If you have more robust conception of autonomy or basic capacities, then you'll get more out of this argument. But I'm just going to go with that because I think it's fairly minimal, and the argument may even address some of those most resistant to positive obligations to aid, libertarians and actual consent theorists, if we keep these capacities minimal. Okay. The kind of coercion I'm interested in, I can also say pretty minimal on. So I'm just going to assume that a rule is coercive roughly when violators are likely to face sanctions for their violation. So a sanction is a punishment or penalty, and coercion usually creates the conditions under which one's best alternative is to do what those subjecting one to coercive rules want one to do. And that's usually explained by the fact that the coerced are threatened by sanctions. Now, coercion here is going to be used pretty broadly to include the use of brute force. So if you don't think that coercion can include that, then just whenever I say coercion, imagine I'm saying coercion or use of force. And then depending on the kinds and amounts of coercion, coercion may or may not undermine your basic capacities. So usually it engages your will or your autonomy in some way. If I put a gun to your head and I say your money or your life, you have to choose to hand over your money. I also think people can be coerced into doing what they would otherwise do freely. So I might have been about to hand the person the money, right? And then they stuck the gun to my head, and yet I'm coerced into it. And I think there's a lot more to say. So a lot will hang on what counts as a violation, as a sanction, as a threat, or a punishment or a penalty on any analysis. So people disagree about whether coercion that has to violate rights or entitlements. Some think that threats can be coercive, others think offers can be coercive. It'll matter at the end of my talk today when I talk about what coercive institutions I think exist, which theory you accept. But go with your favorite count of coercion for now. What matters for me is that coercion requires justification, that it has to be legitimate, where legitimacy is just a justification right to exercise coercive force. So I'm not interested in whether people have an obligation to obey coercive rules. What I'm interested in is what can justify the exercise of coercion, and I'm not assuming anything yet about what justification requires, but that it has to be justified is going to be important. And the argument's going to appeal only to those who accept certain liberal theories, or at least that's my aim. And I'll say more about what I mean in a minute. So I take it that first sort of major claim on your handout, you at least understand what I'm saying when I say that I'm going to defend this legitimate coercion autonomy thesis, that people have to be able to secure basic capacities under coercive rule for that to be legitimate to coerce them. Okay. So why is that? Well, I think it has to do with the nature of liberalism. So recently, liberals have focused a lot on what makes a institution or coercive rulers decent, if not fully just. But I take it that at the heart of liberalism is a concern not only for justice, but also for freedom. And so the kind of freedom at issue is one that's compatible with, but not constituted by the social order. And I think it's one that requires subjects be able to shape their relationship with their rulers and exercise some control over their subjection. So people have to be able to do things like conscientiously object to coercive rules. Okay, and so I need to argue for this, but if that's right, people presumably have to be able to reason about, make, and carry out some significant plans in light of their beliefs, desires, values, or goals in order to consent to or object to coercive rules, right? And that requires that they secure basic reasoning and planning capacities. Okay. So why is this so on many different liberal theories? Well, first, consider a version of hypothetical consent theory. So on hypothetical or reasonable consent theory, legitimacy requires that coercion be in accordance with principles that people could reasonably accept or would choose under an appropriately specified veil of ignorance when they didn't know their particular situation, right? And they're impartial. But reasonable people in this original position would only agree to coercive rules under which they're able to abide by, dissent from, or consent to being subject to at least the general structure of those rules. So on John Rawls' theory, for instance, people would choose principles under which they would be fully autonomous, under which people could understand and embrace these principles. And full autonomy and the ability to understand and embrace Rawls' principles of justice require at least minimal reasoning and planning capacities. Now, you could object here that people, even in a liberally construed original position, would accept some risk of not being able to reason and plan in order to get other benefits or avoid other risks. So in Rawls' original position, for instance, the deliberators are heads of families, right? And they might accept some risk of not being able to reason and plan in order to ensure that their family members can do that. And that's especially likely if there's not enough resources to help everybody do that. But I think, and I agree that there are times when it's impossible, perhaps, for everyone to have the relevant freedoms and capacities. But I think hypothetical consent theorists should at least agree that for coercion to be fully legitimate, people should be able to shape the nature of their relationship with those imposing coercive rules over them, at least insofar as possible. Right, so there might be possibility constraint here, but nonetheless, if it's possible, I think they'd require this. On democratic theory, everyone has to be able to participate in the democratic process, right? They have to be able to do that, and that requires, I think, that people can freely consent to coercive rules. And democratic theorists also accept certain institutional constraints on the exercise of coercive force. So they'll have basic constitutions that protect individuals' freedoms. And I think on a plausible democratic theory, people have to at least have the right to dissent from coercive rules and to practice conscientious objection or nonviolent protest or passive resistance, and they have the capacities for that. It's easiest, I think, to see why actual consent theorists should agree that people have to have basic capacities. Because if you have to freely consent to coercive rules, then you have to be able to do that, right? So it's a necessary condition for free consent. And here's where you get the libertarians, I hope, which is there's an argument that libertarians should be actual consent theorists. And so if that argument works, then maybe this will address those people. But it's hardest to see, I think, why communitarians should agree with this, even liberal communitarians. And there's basically two kinds of communitarian views. So I think on one kind, communitarians think communities are valuable independently of individuals, sort of their role in helping people support or promote or give rise to individual identity. Some communitarians think communities are kind of independently valuable, and they care that certain relationships flourish independent of consent, right? But to keep communities and relationships strong and vibrant, people have to be able to challenge them. They have to be open to challenge, at least from within. People have to have a right to dissent from coercive rules by leaving or at least voicing their disagreement with their communities. So as Charles Taylor puts it, these sorts of freedoms protect the crucial moral interests that each one of us has in the authentic development of the other. And even if rulers don't want to hear heretics or reformers, communities can't remain strong unless their members are capable of inhabiting their traditions in a way that keeps them alive and responsive. There's another kind of communitarian, though. So some communitarians are primarily concerned about communities because they help support or promote or give rise to individual identity. But to do that, then I think they have to support certain individual freedoms. People should be able to decide whether or not to abide by or dissent from or consent to communities' rules for themselves. And I think it has to be that they have these basic freedoms for it to be legitimate to coerce them. Now, some communitarians believe that they're liberals and yet don't think individuals need any substantive freedoms at all for it to be legitimate to coerce people. So Chandra Kukendas, for instance, says people just have to have a formal right to exit their communities. And it was funny because I said this exact thing in front of Chandran once, and it was really embarrassing. But anyway, I disagree. So I tend to think that, as Will Kimlicka suggests, liberalism is committed to and perhaps even defined by the view that individuals should have the freedom and capacity to question and possibly revise the traditional practices of their community, should they come to see them as no longer worthy of allegiance. And those who deny that subjects have to have basic freedoms under coercive rules suggest that it can be legitimate to coerce people, even though they couldn't freely object, which I take it spells the end of liberalism. It's supposed to be funny. Okay, okay. All right, so that's it for the first premise of the argument. But you might say, okay, fine, people have to have basic capacities to, under coercive rules, but why do I, as a coercive ruler, as a state or other coercive institution, have any obligation to them? Right? So that's the second claim, that in fact, coercive rulers have an obligation to ensure people secure these capacities. And I just argue that when rulers subject people who can't secure basic capacities to coercive rules and they don't do what they can to ensure that their subjects secure these capacities, they're legitimate, assuming, of course, the subjects can't secure the capacities on their own or with the help of friends or benefactors, right? And that's because rulers aren't justified in exercising coercive force over those who could but have not secured these capacities. But in the nature of being a coercive ruler, right, they're exercising coercive force, and you're continuing to do that. And since rulers continue to exercise coercive force, legitimacy requires that they do what they can to ensure that their subjects secure basic capacities, if their subjects aren't going to secure these capacities on their own and no one else is helping them. And so that's the argument for the second premise. Let me put it slightly differently, leaving aside a few qualifications, okay? So for coercion to be legitimate, rulers have to either stop coercing people or do what they can to ensure that their subjects secure basic reasoning and planning capacities. I take it that follows from the first premise of the argument. But rulers aren't going to stop coercing people, they're coercive rulers, so they have to do what they can to ensure that their subjects secure basic capacities. And the argument's even more pressing if you think that we should have certain kinds of coercive institutions. Okay, now note, these obligations, if I'm right about this, right, are remedial in a certain way. So others may have the primary obligations to help people secure basic capacities. And it's only if these people can't secure these capacities on their own or with the help of friends or benefactors that there's this obligation in play. So the obligation may not be demanding at all. Others might help people secure these capacities. Young children will generally grow up and be able to reason and plan on their own. But they could be very demanding. So if no one else is helping people secure these capacities and they can't do so on their own, say they're in a coma from which they can't recover without really expensive medical care, then that assistance is required in order for it to be legitimate to coerce them. Of course, you can have a possibility constraint in here. So if it's impossible for someone to consent to any coercive rule or to be able to secure the capacities they need to consent or object under coercive rules, then their capacities, it may not be necessary for them to have these capacities, may not be required that a state help them secure them or that any other coercive institution do so. And there can also be other conditions for legitimacy, right? So if you're a democratic theorist and you think that legitimate states have to have voting booths and hold elections, and it's impossible to both help people get the education, say, that they need to secure basic capacities, and to get the voting booths that you need for a legitimate democracy, maybe there's trade-offs that you'll have to make. Right? Or you can give priority to fulfilling other conditions for legitimacy, but you have to establish that there are other conditions and that they're really in conflict with the one I'm defending. But if this argument is successful and the assumptions I made at the start hold, it's really important, right? Because hundreds of thousands suffer from diseases like malaria, and millions lose their basic reasoning and planning capacities every year because they suffer from easily preventable poverty-related illnesses. So it establishes obligations to a lot of people. Of course, you can object to this, right, in a lot of ways. One thing you might say is, well, if there are significant obligations to help people secure basic capacities, then they can't be grounded in this way, right? So responsibility for the fact that people lack basic capacities may not have anything to do with their coercive rulers. Like brain cancer can undermine your ability to reason and plan. Rulers may even be helping people or do better with respect to these basic capacities than they would otherwise do. They might be doing their fair share to help people. They might be providing other benefits like peace or security. And I agree that coercive rulers have an obligation to provide people with benefits like peace and security. And they might have an obligation to promote basic reasoning and planning capacities for other reasons. So I tend to think human rights are well justified and out of a concern for individuals' interests. But this is supposed to address those who are skeptical of this conclusion to some degree. Right? And so the idea is that states are actually doing something to people that requires justification, namely coercing them. In order for that to be legitimate, people have to have basic capacities. If no one else is helping them secure these capacities, then states or other coercive rulers have an obligation to ensure that these people can reason and plan. And even if you find that implausible, you say, well, look, the consequences are so implausible, I shouldn't accept that. You can't really undercut the argument without saying why one of the premises is false, because I think it's a valid argument or can be made valid. So you have to say, well, okay, you don't agree with the conclusion, why not? Right? And one possibility is to deny the assumption that there is an obligation to act legitimately. I didn't defend that, I just said it's necessary for the argument. Because the obligation to ensure that people secure basic capacities follows from the fact that coercion is otherwise illegitimate, and there's an obligation to act legitimately. But I did nothing to defend that claim, that latter claim. But I think it's a pretty uncontroversial assumption and fairly easy to justify. So following John Locke, you might argue that each person has a natural right to freedom, and so people can't be subject to others' commands without justification. I'm not saying the particular kind of justification I'm offering, that follows from the liberal theory of legitimacy, but some justification, what gives you the right to coerce me, seems like a question that requires an answer. And so I think it's better to suggest that the correct liberal theory doesn't support the legitimate coercion autonomy thesis, doesn't support the claim that people have to have basic freedoms under coercive rules, or that there's an obligation to provide them with those basic freedoms, than to deny the assumption that there's an obligation to act legitimately. But then one would have to agree that coercion can be legitimately exercised even over those who lack basic reasoning and planning capacities and can't even dissent from coercive rules. And if you want to qualify this, look, even when it's not in their interests or doesn't promote their welfare, freedom. Okay, of course, the consequences of accepting my argument might be so implausible that it provides a reductio ad absurdum of liberal theories of legitimacy. So if it turns out that I'm right, that hypothetical consent theory and actual consent theory and all these other theories entail that people have to have these basic freedoms under coercive rules, and you might say, well, that's just a mark against those theories. Right? But that'd be an interesting conclusion in itself, I think. Okay, and so I promised say just a few words about the implications of this for global justice. So you might say, okay, well that sounds plausible enough to me, but why is this important? And I guess it's because I think there's a lot of coercion in international affairs that I think this is important. So let me tell you, just give you some examples that should, I hope, appeal to people with a wide range of views about coercion. Because again, a lot of this is going to hinge on your particular theory, and in the book I try to go systematically through different theories. But take examples of what might constitute indirect coercion. So the WTO imposes sanctions on countries that violate property rights or rules of the market. These sanctions are enforced on countries indirectly by other countries, right? Nonetheless, you might think some of the responsibility for the fact that people in those countries are coerced into abiding by the rules lies with the WTO. Similarly, the UN imposes economic sanctions, air traffic controls, and arms embargoes on other countries. Often these are enforced indirectly by third parties, by other countries. But nonetheless, you might think that people are coerced indirectly into following the rules by their states or other states. Now, you can object to this. You could say this kind of indirect coercion isn't genuine coercion at all. So it's like a matriarch who forces her family to join a country club. Even if the country club refuses to waive the dues, right? And the people are forced to sort of pay them, in a way, to join. It's not really the country club that's responsible here, right? It's the mother. But I take it that many countries' participation in international trade and organizations isn't voluntary in exactly the way becoming a member of a club is voluntary. So highly indebted poor countries, for instance, may have few options but to abide by international institutions rules. So when Bolivia, the IMF required Bolivia to privatize its water supply, Bolivia had to do that despite violent protests in the streets. It might not have had any good option but to enforce those rules. Similarly, Ecuador was required to privatize its sewage system. Many people died from hepatitis A. And again, there's a question about the role of international organizations in coercing people there, but if Ecuador didn't have any good options but to abide by the IMF's rules, then again, the IMF may be responsible for coercing those people, especially if it's the case that many of these countries are in the situation that they're in partly due to those very institutions of previous rules. Right? And the Philippines has had 19 structural adjustment programs, at least back when I was visiting in 1996, and there's some evidence that these are correlated with poor health outcomes and things. All right, or just one final example, in Niger, the IMF required Niger to implement a 19% value-added tax on goods and services in a year when the nomadic herders' income had fallen dramatically. And although causation is notoriously hard to prove, there was a famine in Niger that year. If Niger didn't have any good options but to abide by the rules of the IMF in this case, again, the IMF may bear some of the responsibility for coercing people into paying that tax. I think there's also a lot of direct coercion in international affairs. So the UN creates protectorates and safe zones that are enforced by armies directly by the international armies. So the EU has its own army, NATO armies can go on the ground, and they take people's weapons, they tell them they can't come into certain areas, they exercise traditional kinds of territorial control over areas that coerce people rather directly. But you might say, okay, actually, I have a version of an account of coercion that doesn't countenance these examples. So you might say, coercion has to be backed by a threat that violates rights. And you haven't shown me yet that any of these people were facing threats to violate the rights, or any of these countries were facing threats that, that if they didn't abide by them, would result in rights violations. But I think there's reason to believe that on any plausible account of rights, many of the examples of coercion that I've given violate individuals' rights. So take an example of positive rights theory, and a right where people have rights to aid on much more concessive terms, or countries have rights to aid on much more concessive terms than the World Bank or IMF countenance. Then in saying, you know, we're only going to give you aid on these terms, you're violating people's rights to aid on more concessive terms. Or take a really radical sort of libertarian view of rights, where people have basic rights to free trade and to punishment, right? Or you might think that when the WTO says, hey, countries, you have to reduce your trade barriers only to a certain amount, and anybody who would punish you for keeping some trade barriers in play can't be punished, right? without, well, license, other punishment, is prevented from exercising their basic right to punish. I mean, you can go through examples like this on more moderate views as well. But I think it should be relatively uncontroversial that there are at least some examples of coercion in international affairs. Or if you don't think these are examples of coercion, if you still think they're examples of exploitation or something that requires some justification in light of a liberal theory of legitimacy, then you can run my argument. All right, and so if I'm right, then I think liberals of all sorts should agree that those imposing coercive rules on others have to ensure that their subjects secure basic reasoning and planning capacities, which in our world entails some really significant obligations to the global poor. So, thanks.
Should be.
Hi, folks. We're missing one of our panelists today, so I understand Mike is chairing, and so I'll let him drive, but I'm going to, at this point, limit my comments to Nicole's paper, and then Colleen Murphy, who was unable to attend because of sickness, we may get to her paper on transitional justice, and I'll let Mike take that lead and hopefully be able to participate a little bit in that. Like any good professor, I have more questions than answers, and I don't have prepared remarks simply because ahead of time we got only abstracts from our presenters. I'll try to ask these questions with some answers of my own, and then hopefully Nicole and Mike can offer their answers as well. So as I gather Nicole's comments in her paper and the overall argument is that, first of all, it's good that people, the normative side is that people should have rights. We don't know where they come from. She's not making a natural rights argument, although she brings up John Locke, and she's willing to give space to that argument that everyone born of human DNA deserves certain full rights, whether they're recognized by government or not. And that the governments that rule over these people, or rule with these people, I'm wondering how democratic her vision is, need to be legitimate. So my first question is how liberal and how democratic is her thesis? Is it important that people have rights so that they can be full moral agents? Or is it important that they have rights so that they can be citizens in a democracy? How are these capacities that we know people can have but don't get developed in many places? Are these capacities to reason, these capacities to plan one's life project, are they intrinsic goods or are they instrumental goods? I think the liberal would say that they're intrinsic, that whether you're coming from a Kantian perspective, which I sense that this perspective might fundamentally be or primarily be, or a Lockean one, whether people use those rights or not is not important. To have the capacity to reason and to plan makes it possible that you become any kind of person you want to be. But that those fundamental human capacities that you have are intrinsic goods, and whether you use them in one way or another doesn't matter. If we're in a fully liberal regime, we're not going to be paternalistic, right? We're going to educate people, we're going to lift them up from abject poverty where they can't develop their reasoning and planning capacities, and then we're going to leave them alone. We're not going to demand that they do any sort of citizenship duty beyond minimal ones. We're not going to, the state is certainly not going to give them a life project or a limited amount of life projects that they can follow, but rather it's up to them. And that's part of what autonomy has to mean. But are we interested in developing these capacities for other reasons? Are they also instrumental goods? And this is where this thesis or these theses of Nicole's could be very instrumental, not just intrinsic. Is it important that people are democratic citizens? Is it important that governments get their legitimacy not just because they recognize rights? How strong is her democratic thesis? How strong is the notion of community autonomy, that our political community, whatever this legitimate scale of political community is, that community is democratic, and that the community itself is autonomous? not just the people therein. The second question of three that I have is regarding the social contract. When we talk about consent, and my background is political theory, and so that's the lens that I have here. I wonder what the role of the social contract is here. Nicole's focus on different types of consent shows her sensitivity to this notion, but is social contract a meaningless concept? I wonder. Here in the United States, we all have consented to the social contract that keeps the union together. You all signed that contract, didn't you? Upon birth or upon coming of age, upon full vestment of your rights at age 18 or 21? Of course not. No one signed a contract. So that contract is implicit. And if that implicit contract is only, if that contract is only implicit, is it really a contract? Are we, as John Locke says, expressing our consent to government by simply paying taxes, traveling on the roads, using the bridges and beaches and parks? Is that tacit consent enough? Or is a contract, social contract, a meaningless, if it's not explicit, if it's not express, is it a meaningless concept? Or is there some social contract concept here that could be useful? You know, in that liberal tradition, it's very ethnocentric, right? I mean, there are different types of consent. The indirect coercion that Nicole talks about, I think, could also be framed in terms of consent. There's plenty of tacit consent in a non-liberal sort of way. When you think of kingships or other forms of authority that don't rest on voting, don't rest on the types of consent that we would, in a liberal tradition, be pretty concerned with. That type of consent could be very strong, but be very illiberal. You know, I consent because the king is who my parents and their parents and their parents and their parents all consented to, and thus I will as well. And that type of consent can certainly license certain human rights abuses that we would be worried about. Thirdly, it's funny, Nicole, the last line of your abstract that I read was quite provocative. It was referring to international institutions. You say, so if no one else is ensuring that these people can secure these things, capacities to plan and reason, the only way for coercive international institutions to be legitimate is if they do so. And I noticed that you left that out of your presentation.
We intend to endorse that claim.
Okay, fantastic. So what sort of role does that have for, I don't know what the correct term is, but for NGO-type institutions that are, whose authority is incomplete? You know, we have the WTO and we have trade associations and we have associations that set themselves up as advocacy organizations. I wonder if there's new space in a globalized and mediatized world where transparency, I think, proceeds in a positive direction, where we know more about human rights abuses than, or we have the capacity to know more about abuses than we ever have been. What does that mean for international, new potential for international conventions on, say, workers' rights or women's rights? Could this be done in non-conventional ways? Might we not need a single international organization that would be in charge of rooting out injustices and bringing people to justice and bringing up these questions? But you know, the more that we know about Apple's factories in China and the treatment of workers in various places, which is not a new discussion, it's been a discussion 100 years old, easily. Could we be developing new sorts of standards for international accountability that would be outside current organizational structures? I wonder about that one as well. So with those comments and questions, I'd just turn it back over. Mike, I don't know if you want to address those or throw those back to Nicole, but...
Let's give Nicole a chance to respond to those.
All right, so thanks so much for the thought-provoking questions. I should say first that this isn't my attempt to give my full theory of justice or even legitimacy. It's just one necessary condition for legitimacy that I think we can use to generate certain obligations. And I don't think it's even, if I'm right about this might generate certain obligations to the poor, it's not the main reason I think we should help the poor. So if I see someone bleeding in front of me, I think the main reason I should help them is they're bleeding in front of me, right? So appropriately responding to their interests requires certain things of me. I think I'm obligated to aid people. But then if I'm also doing something to this person, namely coercing them or forcing them to do something, I think that requires justification. I think that requires a reason. And so I'm trying to suggest, that in order for that to be legitimate, people have to at least be able to object, if not consent, to those rules, and that requires basic capacities and adequate food and water and so forth. And so if nobody else is helping them secure these things, and the only way I can legitimately coerce them, I think, is if I help them secure those capacities. So is this a liberal view? Well, it's supposed to be derived from many liberal views. Is it a democratic view? It has very little to do with maybe one necessary condition for democracy. So we say, well, if you're a democratic theorist and you think legitimacy vests in people's social contract of a certain kind where people have to participate in the democratic process, there's got to be certain institutional constraints on that, like a constitutional constraint. And I would say that if you want to have a plausible democratic theory, then it should embody protections of people's basic freedoms. Otherwise, we're not justified, if it's collectively, perhaps, in coercing those people, if that's the appropriate way to describe the coercion that democratic states exercise. Is it important for people to be full moral agents and be citizens? I certainly think so. It's just not what I was arguing right here. So I do think there's sort of intrinsic value in certain basic capacities. And it is important to talk about citizenship, and I hope we hear more about it. I guess as far as your second question, so you said, well, what's the role of this social contract? Have we entered into a social contract? I guess I'm not sure if I'm a contractualist. I mean, I find John Simmons' arguments really compelling that even actual consent might be required in some ideal theory to justify coercive rules. But we're in a very non-ideal world where getting everybody's actual consent, even everybody's tacit consent, might be infeasible, and there's other things at stake besides legitimacy. So perhaps there's hard trade-offs to be made. I don't know. You said there's a certain kind of indirect coercion that might have been consented to when we have states that have agreed to international rules and coercing people into abiding by those rules. And I think that might be true, that the states have consented, and if they're legitimate democratic states, then those people who have participated in the democratic process, right, would have obligations, perhaps, and might be seen as having consented. It's not true in our world that everyone has consented to this in the way that I think would be necessary. It's not true that people have the basic freedoms and capacities at issue that are necessary for consent. So many of the global poor who are delirious because they're suffering from malaria or some other disease. Not that most of the global poor are like this, but certain people, whether they're schizophrenic or have autism or they have poverty-related illness, are lacking the capacities they need to consent. And if those capacities are necessary to fully legitimate a state, then at best we're going to be doing some kind of non-ideal theory when we say, well, okay, it's legitimate for international institutions then to coerce these people. Maybe that's true if there's other hard trade-offs that have to be made, but as a matter of ideal theory, I think that people do need these capacities under coercive rules, and if states haven't enabled them to secure these capacities, then it might be the primary obligation of states to do that. Then it's still a question to the international institutions, say it's insofar as you're coercing those people, is your relationship with those people appropriately free? So it might be that there's sort of remedial obligations on the part of international organizations that are coercing people, and whether NGOs do that or not, I don't know. Mostly when I've thought about this, I've thought about these international treaty organizations and functioning in some way as a global system of international law. And I think there is a strong case to be made that many of these organizations are exercising coercion on many different theories. So I tried to sketch that very quickly for you, but I don't know if that was compelling at the end. Did that sort of answer the question?
Can we put your position a more standard liberal argument to the same end, I think. This is from a book by a guy named Fleischacker. It's called A Short History of Distributive Justice. And this is what he presents as a core liberal argument that sort of overlaps with Sen, Rawls, Nussbaum, and some others, Pogge, and the global justice discussion. So what I wanted to ask Nicole is, what do we gain with her argument we don't get with this one? Okay. So each individual, not just societies or the human species as a whole, has a good that deserves respect. And individuals are due certain rights and protections in the pursuit of that good. I'm presuming that would include the capacities and abilities to make decisions, to learn how to reason for yourself so you can consent and so forth. So you have a right to that. Secondly, some share of material goods is part of every individual's due, part of the rights and protections that everyone naturally deserves. I put that in parentheses and put a question about whether or not Fleischacker actually intended naturally deserves. The third, the fact that every individual deserves this can be justified rationally in purely secular terms. Now, up to this point, his argument is, this is a new development in the idea of distributive justice, that people ultimately deserve not to be poor. Deserve not to be poor based on no considerations of merit. Fourth, the distribution of the share of goods is practicable. Attempting consciously to achieve it is neither a fool's project nor, like the attempt to enforce friendship, something that would undermine the very goal it seeks to achieve. And finally, therefore, the state, and not merely private individuals or organizations, ought to be guaranteeing the distribution, or have an obligation to do so, or a duty to do so. So given that argument to the same end, what do we gain from your position that we don't get from this one?
Good. Okay, so I mean,
okay?
I want to just say again, I think the primary reason I have to help somebody lies out of a concern for their basic interests, welfare, and autonomy. So I would say that in the first place. But then there's certain people, like maybe Jan, who think that, look, if we haven't done anything to anyone, we don't owe anything to them necessarily, right? We don't have positive obligations to aid the global poor. We should just let them be. But it's precisely to protect individual freedom on this argument that we have these obligations. And I think it is something that requires an answer. What justifies you in coercing me, right? What justifies the state in exercising coercive rule over somebody? And if it turns out that whatever it is that justifies that also justifies obligations to aid them, I think we've made progress in more fully understanding our moral obligations. Now you might think, hey, this libertarian alternative, it's radically implausible. Why should we even engage with that? But I guess I think that libertarianism at least plays a role in political philosophy that idealism plays in epistemology. It might strike you as radically implausible, but it's something that we have to seriously engage with to see if it is wrong, right? I also think it can address statist views. So certain statists are concerned about coercion within a state. But if I'm right that there's a lot of coercion in international affairs, and the same reason, the same obligations of legitimacy or justice that apply within the state also generate significant obligations of properly global justice. How significant may depend on how significant these capacities are that one's willing to grant are necessary for people to have a relationship, a free relationship with the rulers. And even if it's true that these people would generally endorse these obligations out of a concern for human rights, or something, they still think they have to agree that these obligations are properly global justice or legitimacy and not just merely charitable obligations or something, if those arguments are right.
I guess this is a version of Michael's question. It has to do with my being puzzled why you think that provision of basic capacities, which I think is a condition for legitimacy, has any very special role for the provision of one particular basic capacity, basic capacities to engage in reasoning and planning. Like you, I think it's very important to ask under what conditions coercion is legitimized, because although we have a duty of general beneficence, I think it's not very demanding, whereas our duties to those we help to coerce are very demanding. But look, suppose I were to read, as I have, stories of travels to Zaire or Afghanistan, And I discover that these are places where people, 1 in 5 die before the age of 5. People live lives of drudgery in order to merely survive. On that basis, I conclude that if their government could do better and doesn't, it's illegitimate. If these people are self-respecting, then they can't willingly support their political order. Sound okay so far? And it's specifically about the legitimation of coercion. Now, suppose I then learn something that actually I believe, that these people are capable of basic reasoning and planning. I, in fact, think it would be insulting to say that these people are not capable of basic reasoning and planning. That does not do one thing to me, so far as the question of whether they're being coerced is legitimate is concerned. It seems to me that there's a big category of basic capabilities whose deprivation constitutes a desperate need.
Sure.
That's where all the action is, as far as legitimizing coercion is concerned. And it seems to me a distortion to locate all the action in this one, admittedly important, but far from all important.
Absolutely, and I don't at all mean to say any of that. So I do think that most of the global poor are perfectly capable of doing the kinds of basic reasoning and planning capacities, have the basic reasoning and planning capacities I'm talking about. There are 18 million people who die every year from easily preventable poverty-related illnesses. Many of those diseases undermine people's basic capacities. And so I use these minimal ones mostly because I'm interested in getting consensus on what at least is required for free consent or freedom under coercive rules, but I think actually much more is required for people to sort of be free under coercive rules. And so if there's more robust capacities that are at issue, then I think you can get a lot more out of this argument. So for instance, you have to understand the coercive rules to which you're subject, and that requires understanding things like the World Trade Organization. Then you have to have you might get pretty extensive obligations to educate people out of this kind of argument, for instance. So I don't know about the first half of your question. I didn't quite fully understand it, so you might have to repeat it. But as far as the second, I'm not saying in any way that most of the global poor lack the capacities I use to illustrate the argument. I do think that what is interesting about the argument is it establishes that whatever capacities are necessary for people to have under coercive rules for the relationship with their rulers to be free, and I think, like I said, they're probably much more robust than the ones I've started with, that we, those who are coercing people, have a remedial obligation to ensure that they secure those capacities as a condition of legitimacy, if legitimacy is properly part of global justice or justice, and out of a concern for justice. So that would establish they're having a lot of significance or demandingness, maybe, on your view.
So is it because without the capacities, people don't have the ability to freely consent? If that were the argument, I would see a specific connection with basic reasoning and basic plan making. Or is it because if people could be given these capacities by their government and aren't, it's a violation of their self-respect?
No, it's something about self-respect. So the thought is,
then we do disagree.
Well, so here's the thing, yeah. So there's many different liberal theories you might embrace. I take it that you embrace a hypothetical consent theory of legitimacy. Sounded like from your talk today, I don't know. But suppose you do. Let's take that one for illustration. The idea is that in order for people under an original veil of ignorance in the original position, and if it's appropriately liberal, will only agree to principles of justice under which they have full autonomy if you're a Rawlsian, or at least these basic capacities. And so the thought is to derive from the hypothetical consent theory a commitment to people having basic capacities under coercive rules as a condition for legitimacy. If you are an actual consent theorist, you think people have to actually freely agree to coercive rules. I say, well, to actually agree, people have to be able to agree. That at least requires minimal reasoning and planning. Probably requires a lot more, right? Good options, information, and so forth. So it depends on what liberal theory of legitimacy you endorse, how I'm going to run the argument. I just think that there is this common core to liberal theories that expresses a concern for people's basic freedom, again, freedom that's not constituted by the social order, but is compatible with certain kinds of constraints on social life. People have to at least be able to do things like object to coercive rules. If you endorse that, that's great. If you don't, then I'd say, okay, well, what liberal theory of legitimacy do you embrace? Why doesn't it entail that? Is that really a liberal theory that you want to embrace? You know, that's the challenge. You might say, yes, I have a liberal theory, and I don't think it entails that. I'm quite happy with it. Say, okay, well, it's not properly liberal according to me, you know, but we have a disagreement.
Nicole, I've got many puzzlements with this paper.
Okay.
And the first one just requires a clarification of something. I guess everybody has a copy of the printed version. If not, it might be an idea to go back to the first slide so that we can all see it. The first sentence of your paper will do.
Sorry, where do you want me to start? Sorry.
The very first sentence.
General propositions?
All right, yeah, the one you had is fine.
Okay, great.
Right there. Now, grammatically, that sentence, coercion can only be legitimate if it is exercised over people who secure basic reasoning. Now, is the word secure a verb or an adjective?
Who have is fine.
What?
People have to have basic capacities under coercive rules.
Okay, so that the word have should really be between who and secure, who have these secure basic.
We just ignore, you can replace secure with have, I think it's fine.
Because what you've got would raise the question, well, I mean, it makes it look as though those people themselves need to do what's necessary in order to secure those.
No, they just have to have the capacity.
That's not what you meant.
Yeah, just have the capacities.
What you meant is that they have to have these and they have to be secure.
They have to have and maintain them under coercive rules until they freely relinquish them, or you know, or unless it's impossible for them to have them or something like that.
Now, okay, now, so here, in addition to the questions that Dick Miller just raised, which are entirely,
well,
I think,
if you
correct,
repeat them, maybe I'll understand.
I want to just ask, firstly, you don't distinguish carefully between coercion and force here. And if we raise the question in terms of force rather than coercion, it seems to me perfectly clear that if some, for example, maniac is attempting to kill me and is quite incapable of autonomously deciding not to, nevertheless, I get to shoot him, right? I can protect myself against somebody who's not autonomous.
And you can enter, yeah, you can put that in as a
It's not the case that I have to go through a whole lot of things to make him autonomous before I can do this. Right?
Yeah,
now, coercion is a different matter, because coercion requires a certain amount of rationality on the part of the coerced person. He's got to be able to envisage these alternatives and choose between them. But of course, your coercing him means that you have fiddled with his alternatives. That is, you have eliminated some of what alternatives that he would normally take and put him in a position where he has to choose between two things, neither of which he'd like to take if he had his choice, really, right? I want to say that first, it's not clear why you should be determined to justify government. I mean, I think governments in general are not legitimate. Secondly, I don't see why it's so very difficult to meet the condition that you call autonomy, and it certainly doesn't require even that you be in good physical condition. I don't see why this is going to have the implications you apparently think it does have for how we should treat the third world poor.
I suppose so it's not going to get us obligation. If we just use these basic capacities that are used to illustrate the argument, all it gets you is that those people who can no longer reason and plan because they're so malnourished or so undermined by some other disease, that we have obligations to them, right? Which is still significant because there's so many people who have that. But yeah.
I mean, of course, since I think we've got obligations to everybody. And I mean, that's one of the background problems, that most of the things you're trying to justify aren't justifiable anyhow. And given that, I mean, it's going to have to be an incredibly minimal government that's going to meet the conditions that the libertarian would want to impose. And then the fact that it only applies to people who are able to understand the terms and so forth isn't a very minimizing factor, since in regard to all the rest of them, of course, you can't. I mean, coercion of them is not legitimate, but it will also probably not be necessary, because all you're going to do is protect yourself against them if they offer a threat, and otherwise do nothing. Your option of don't rule over them is available quite generally.
Yeah, so when I actually give the argument to libertarians, so I do it in a whole separate paper, and it goes into all the qualifications you have to make, and I think it actually poses a challenge.
So what you've got here, then, I think you'll agree, really doesn't have serious implications of the kind that it sounded as though you think it has.
No, I do think that this is the core strand of the argument. So I think that for a libertarian, for instance, you do have to allow, there's an exception for justified punishment. You have to say libertarianism is distinct from minarchism. So we cannot cease to exercise the traditional kinds of territorial control, that monopoly and coercive force within a unified territory over people. So this argument may just force libertarians to be anarchists, but if it spells the end of libertarianism, I'm happy with that. Right, so I mean, I'd have to say a lot more on that particular view to convince you, I think. But the idea is that there's this core strand in liberal thought that if libertarians have to be anarchists and have to accept actual consent there, you can at least see a crystal of the argument. The libertarians, too, should agree that there are significant obligations justified in this way to help people at least secure basic reasoning and planning capacities. And I kept it so minimal because I think, you know, there's a question about how much libertarians are going to accept with respect to
it's a question of what you want to do with them,
consent.
isn't it? I mean, suppose that I want to make a you know, I want to hire you, I want to employ you to do something, and you don't have the ability to do it. Well, I mean, part of my package is going to have to be some training. If you don't get this, then you won't accept it, right? Period. Not a problem. And something analogous seems to me to be would be true about government, and it isn't going to give you very much government, and that doesn't surprise me because for the reasons above mentioned.
I mean, if you take consent, you know, pretty much at face value, and people just have to sort of reason and be able to do this kind of minimal instrumental reasoning and planning capacity, then you don't get a lot. But if you think people have to have decent options under coercive rules to sort of freely consent to or be able to exercise, you know, the capacities they need to consent to or object to coercive rules, they have to understand them, then you get a lot more out of this argument. In fact, it may be really demanding in terms of what you can get, and I would endorse that view. So, yeah.
All right, so if I misinterpret any part of your argument, just correct me. But as I understand it, you're arguing that legitimacy is contingent on the conditions that the people, so legitimacy of governance is contingent on the condition that the people who are being governed have the capacity to reason and plan. And so from that, we have an obligation then to promote reason and planning in ways that are coercive, and so those ways aren't actually justified. It just seems that your argument undermines itself and actually makes an argument for not promoting reason and planning of people who don't have the capacity for it, because it would be an unjustified system of coercion. Given that, then, I wonder why you don't adopt some other tradition, like a capabilities approach, which I think you're more concerned with, as far as I understood, because you talk about that individual freedom is what we're trying to secure, and I think that I would contest that point itself, but if it is individual freedom that you're trying to secure, isn't it the capability to exercise the freedom and not just the capacity itself? And then that would be something far more robust, and then you would have to be intervening not only to give people food and medical aid, but also to overthrow regimes that don't allow people to exercise their autonomy. So
yeah, maybe this goes to Richard's point too. So he said, you know, what does this illegitimacy entail? And I think legitimacy is a degree notion, right? And so there's a certain threshold over which, you know, reform is required. That's all I assume is necessary here. After another threshold, perhaps international intervention is required or permitted. I'm not making any claims about that one. But I do tend to think people should have basic capacities and so forth. I just think that that argument isn't the only reason we have, you know, people have basic interests and rights, and I think those generate obligations on our part to ensure they secure basic capacities. But there's an additional reason I think we have to ensure that people can secure these capacities, and it does come from a kind of capability theory, right? So the thought is that people, if they have to have basic capacities under coercive rule and no one else is helping them secure it, and they can't secure it on their own, then the only way a coercive institution can be legitimate is if they help them secure it. So it's kind of remedial obligation. And then you said one other thing. So yeah, there's this question about the temporal idea. So yeah, it would be illegitimate for me to coerce somebody who could secure these capacities but hasn't. I think that does pose a little bit of a problem. But if you think about it, how it actually works, kids grow up and they're currently unable to secure, most of the time when they're really young, unable to secure even these basic capacities. But at some point they're able to, and states should have provided them with those conditions necessary for them to secure it by the time that they're capable of doing it, because there's this possibility constraint. Right? If it's impossible for somebody to secure it, then it's not required. So as soon as possible, you have to help the person, and as long as you do that, then you're legitimate, right? So it's just demanding. I don't think it's impossible. But I see,
I mean, I just the point is that I think that the foundation of your argument just doesn't imply any strong duties. And I would just think that you would start with something else, like the reason that governance is legitimate is because it promotes certain goods, common goods, desires of a community to live together, and it's not necessarily embedded in reason, and when you embed it in reason, you immediately exclude people who are disabled, you exclude non-human animals, and it just doesn't seem to imply that we have any obligations if we start from this point.
Well, so I think this does, and to precisely those people, right? So I think you're right to when say, look, I'm unsatisfied, this isn't enough, right? And I don't claim that it's enough. I think we have much more demanding obligations to people. Let me just say that really loudly. It's not that I think this is it and this is the limit.
I think you do, and that's why I think maybe you need a different starting point, because this doesn't really do any work for you.
It gets you something really important, though, I think. It's really important to recognize that there's a reason that we're doing something to people, we're coercing them that requires justification. If I'm right, that they have to have these basic capacities. Again, the only way they can be legitimate, if nobody else is helping people secure these capacities, and they can't secure it on their own, and they're going to continue to coerce people, is if they help them. So it does generate obligations to those 18 million people or so
But they would be then illegitimate conditions by your argument.
Well, yeah, they can, as long as they do it as soon as possible.
But so why not just start from something more robust that would also get to the core of what we're trying to achieve, which is human good, rather than
because then there's no obligations
of reason and
justice necessarily. I mean, you can assert that it is,
we
but
cannot go on like this in one-sided fashion. We have to diversify, get more questions. Please, Michael, exercise your authority, okay? Please act, okay? It's going on in one way for too long. Anybody, any other question? Yeah. Let's have a few questions. Let's diversify.
Good. Sorry, I should have cut it off. I'm sorry.
Nicole, thank you very much. I'm not sure I fully understand also the underlying presumptions in your argument, but I do think you're trying to do something quite interesting. I think, so I'm going to try and reflect on that, and hopefully we can talk about it more. But I want to ask whether you might be trying to hang too much on a very thin peg, small peg. There are many directions one could go with this, but let me, in the interest of brevity, just mention one. I wonder why you think that there is a pass-through, to use an economist's term, from the failure of individuals to have certain kinds of capacities for reasons of biology, for example, being afflicted by malaria, to any kind of proposition at all about interstate coercion. I would have thought that if there are people afflicted by malaria who, for that biological reason, have some limitation of reasoning capacity, and that is a very, very particular case, I must underline. And that's another reason why I'm not sure about the general empirical relevance of this argument. But if there is a particular country where there is a certain proportion of the population that is afflicted by this, that seems to be neither here nor there as far as the ability of that country to field representatives in world trade negotiations who are not afflicted by malaria, and who are entirely able to reason about the effects of trade, the trade regime that's being proposed on the country. Okay. So it's very obscure to me why you think there's any sort of implication about the inappropriateness of an interstate regime of this kind. And maybe you can adumbrate. Thank you.
Good. So, I mean, I think there, this is a book-long argument I'm trying to put in, and maybe I took on a too big of a bite here for the audience. But let me just say, so the claim is that you probably think coercion of the sort that's exercised, I mean, you may not, right? You might not think there's any coercion in international affairs. But let's suppose you agree with me. There's lots of coercion in international affairs. It requires some justification, right? I want to nod every time I sort of stop. Is that true? Does it require some justification? You might think it's probably perfectly justified, but does it require some justification?
I'm not very keen on, I'm not sure I accept the legitimacy of the coercive demand that I nod to each and every question,
well,
but
I want to see where
let's say that I agree on that.
Yeah, I just want to see where our disagreement lies so I can point to the right part of the argument for you. So you say, okay, yes, it requires some justification. And I say, okay, well, what kind of theory of justification, what kind of theory of legitimacy do you have? And you might say, well, I'm a hypothetical consent theorist. I'm an actual consent theorist. I'm a communitarian. I'm an actual consent theorist. I say, will you endorse one of the above for me? You can pick. I don't care.
No, I don't want to also run afoul of Professor Chatterjee's injunction in the way that others have. But let me just say one thing, and then I want to sit down, which is that I don't disagree at all that aspects of the international system require justification, and in particular the coercive aspects require justification.
I'm just trying to illustrate the argument.
What I'm trying to understand is how the fact that certain number of individuals within poor countries are afflicted by this particular kind of failure of reasoning abilities, which is an empirical postulate we would have to investigate separately,
sure.
Has an implication with regard to how we how we defend or otherwise assess the coerciveness or lack thereof of the international
the simple
system.
answer, if you want it in one sentence, is this: we're doing something to those people. We're coercing them. That requires justification, and I tried to give you an argument that's valid that entails that the requisite justification is that people have basic capacities, basic freedoms under coercive rule. And if no one else is helping those people secure them, and they can't secure them on their own, the only way the coercive institutions to which they're subject can be legitimate as a matter of logical necessity is if they help them. And so the only way to fulfill a condition for legitimacy, I think, is entailed by liberal theories, is that there's certain obligations.
Just, if I could interrupt for a second, it's a diverse audience, and it has been going on in one direction for too long time on abstruse points. We need to diversify, open it up. Luke Garrett had been sitting there. He raised 3 very interesting questions that have not been addressed yet, in a detailed way. So why not give Luke, if you wish, some chance? You raised 3 questions. Would you like to perhaps come up with your own sort of answer to that from some other angle? That would be quite interesting for the sake of diversity. For example, one of your questions had to do with the NGOs vis-a-vis, what's going on. What would be your idea of legitimacy vis-a-vis role of international NGOs in foreign countries, vis-a-vis their governance, the governance of the countries where they are? Would you like to comment something?
Oh, I was hoping the microphone didn't work, Professor Chatterjee. I kind of want to hit the ball back to Nicole and perhaps Michael. Because I don't have points to make in the way that some of the interlocutors have demonstrated about the kind of the structural integrity of Nicole's argument. Could we take this, Nicole and Michael, in a different direction? I mean, as far as the conclusion goes, I feel like I've lost a lot of my normative mojo because the fact that the international world is so anarchic, I used to laugh at realists in international relations because they just had no imagination at all. Not only did they bother me because they seemed to be ethically vapid, but that they were willing to accept this horrible status quo of realist power politics on an international level. But I find myself, I don't know it, maybe it's the practice of politics coming back to issues, back to conclusions that, okay, if it's the responsibility of international organizations to make sure that people have fundamental human rights, the way we get there is so difficult. And the way that we've tried to get there in the 20th century with IGOs has been, in so many instances, so ineffectual that I default to other ways of possibly achieving those goals. And maybe I'm just willing to accept something that's normatively so far from being a full glass of water that I'm willing to entertain that. But what of agitation outside established IGOs, outside established advocacy networks? Do we have the possibility for kind of a commonsensical international human rights convention to be expressed through different means?
Can I kibitz on that, Luke? There may be two ways in which coercion is being used here, too, or two ways in which you can focus on coercion and what it does or doesn't have to do with these basic obligations that you wind up suggesting we have to fulfill on the part of people's reasoning capacities and their development as rational, capable of being making free consent. I mean, if the issue is global justice with regard to people's abilities to develop as decent, thinking, reasonable human beings, then deriving some obligation from focusing on the legitimacy of coercive forms of government seems to me to be a kind of a diversion we don't need. I mean, the legitimacy of coercive forms of government has to do with their authority to enforce the rule of law or compel obedience to the rule of law. That's why there's legitimate coerciveness to those governments. And obviously you want people to be capable of rational, reasonable thinking that allows them to go along with or to understand the reasonableness of their being compelled to be obedient to that kind of government. But that kind of coercive government is both liberal and non-liberal. And the issue here is who has the obligation ultimately to see to it the people who might otherwise not get it, the developmental needs met that enables them to become these free, rational, and consent-capable people, whether it's NGOs, the national government, or some international institution. Then there's the issue of how do you secure, coercively speaking, governments to do this sort of thing when they're not actually fulfilling these obligations. They may be coercive governments, but not securing these development needs for their people who they think should have them, perhaps, in order to be freely consenting to their coercive form of government. But suppose they don't do it, who coerces them then? How do you coerce people to fulfill these obligations? There isn't any really effective international regime that can do that except the use of war or something maybe like sanctions.
So I wonder if it has to be through coercion. So we have to somehow reform international institutions so that where international institutions need reform in order for people to meet some of these basic needs. And Richard Miller is talking about reforming the rules of trade through the World Trade Organization, whether his proposal is the right one or not. There's many things we might do to help people meet their basic needs. And I think some of them, that would, if people met their basic needs because, I don't know, a doctor came up with a cure for malaria, then there wouldn't be the challenge, right, that I'm posing to these institutions, that you're coercing people who lack capacities, for whatever reason, they lack them. They just wouldn't be those people. So if we could do things like fair trade in pharmaceutical and biotechnology, maybe we could help people meet some of those basic health needs. Changing, Thomas Pogge has an idea for a global health impact fund. So we could create an international treaty and restructure pharmaceutical incentives for research so that people can access the basic medicines that they need to avoid autonomy undermining disabilities. I think there's a lot of things we could do, but there's not going to be one single solution. I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Well, let's call it time at this point because it's after our allocated time by 15 minutes, so we started 15 minutes late. I want to thank you all for coming and remind you that there's a slip to fill out, if you would, concerning the session, if you would take the time to do that. And thank you all for coming. There are 3 sessions, I think, tomorrow, Dean, that will also meet here, beginning at 9 o'clock.
Thanks for all the hard questions.
Thank you.